Hello and welcome back to Economics with Professor Klein at Cuesta College. So the topic of today's video is business costs and production, and I'm going to break this down because it's got a lot of things to be discussed. So we're going to start this series with marginal productivity of labor, right? And so we need to understand what this means and how we calculate it because it's going to play into the costs of the business. So the marginal productivity of labor is the additional product, right? Marginal is very important in microeconomics. It is the additional productivity. And we can either think about this per worker, which is what we'll focus on, or it could be per hour of work, right? We can define the units as we need. But it's the additional, right? The additional product, the additional amount that we are able to produce. So we're going to go through an example because that's the best way to really understand the marginal product of labor. And so we're going to start with the idea that I'm going to buy a snow cone machine. And I'm going to buy a snow cone machine so that I can sell snow cones, right? And so we're going to do this by number of workers. And then we're going to look at the output, right? Or the product, either one. These are pretty much interchangeable terms in economics. So if there's no one working, there's no snow cones, right? Not a big shocker there. And so this is pretty much an assumption of nearly every model, right? We're not going to, things don't turn themselves on, machines don't turn themselves on, right? And so without any workers, we're not going to be able to produce anything. Now, I then, who bought the snow cone machine, decide that I'm going to turn on the snow cone machine, and I find that I am able to sell 20 snow cones, let's say, per hour, because I don't want to insult myself and say per day. That seems a little low, right? So working by myself, I am able to produce 20 snow cones an hour, but the problem is that I have to split my time, right? Sometimes I'm creating snow cones and adding the flavoring, and then other times I am handing them to people and taking their money and putting it in the register or cash box or whatever it is, right? So I'm splitting my time. So I decide that I'm going to hire one more worker, right? So I hire somebody else to help me out. And it turns out that when I hire this second worker, we up our productivity to 50 snow cones per hour. This is great, right? One of us is working at the snow cone machine. One of us is working at the cash register. We are engaging in specialization, right? And so we've now increased our product to 50. Then I decide, well, this is working out so well. Why don't I just hire people, train them, and then they can produce the snow cones. I'll stand there and do some advertising and get people to come. And turns out that with all of us working, we are able to produce 75 snow cones in total per hour, right? And then I hire the fourth person, and with 4 people, we're getting 90 per hour, right? Now, probably, and this is outside of what we're going to discuss for this topic, but probably in order to get 90 snow cones per hour, I either have to have a much larger snow cone machine or I had to buy a second snow cone machine, right? And so later on, we'll talk about demand and supply of resources. We can't just continue to hire people. We also often need to employ more capital or more land. And we'll talk about those decisions later on. All right. So let's just ignore that I probably need a second snow cone machine for now. And then I'm going to guess that as I hire the 5th person, you know, they just kind of get in everyone's way. They make people stumble. And so now we're down to 85 snow cones per hour. Now, this one seems pretty clear, right? If this is what I find, that after I hire the 5th worker, that our total production drops, then I'm probably going to let that person go or just not have 5 people working any given shift, right? But before we even get there, when we look at marginal production of labor, we're going to find the term diminishing marginal product. And you could also diminishing marginal returns happens as well. This is a well-established idea that anytime we start to consider marginal, at some point, we're going to experiencing diminishing marginal returns, in this case, diminishing marginal product. So marginal, right, again, is the additional, or particularly important, the change in. And so this is why when you see marginal, you're going to very often see the Greek letter delta. That's what that triangle is, the Greek letter delta. And in economics and in mathematics, the Greek letter delta tells us that it is the change in, right? So if we have 0 workers, we haven't changed from anything. There's no change that occurs there, so there's no marginal production. When we've changed, when we've hired 1 additional worker, going from 0 to 1, our product increased from 0 to 20, right? And so our marginal product is 20. When I hired the second person, right, our marginal product went from 20 to 50. So, sorry, our total product went from 20 to 50. So our marginal product is 30. We've increased our production by 30. When I hired the third person, right, we went from 50 to 75. The marginal product of labor is now 25. It is at the third worker where we exhibit diminishing marginal returns in this example, right? It's not just when this is negative. When this is negative, this says, hey, you shouldn't hire this person. What we want to realize at 3, right, at hiring the third worker is now they aren't bringing in as much as hiring the second. But that doesn't necessarily tell me whether or not I should continue to keep them on, right? It doesn't tell me whether or not I should have 3 workers in this shift or not. I need more information before I can answer that, right? What information is going to be important here? Well, how much am I paying this person? How much am I paying the third worker? If I'm selling, and how much am I selling snow cones for, right? If I'm selling snow cones for $1 and they're bringing in an additional 25 per hour, well, as long as I pay them less than 25 per hour, then this is worth it. But the reason why we need to understand this is that this becomes the point where we actually have to start deciding, right? This one is a no-brainer. If they're not bringing you anything, you shouldn't have 5 people working that shift, right? It's going to hinder the amount that you have. And this happens when people, if it's too small of a space, right? And so they end up dropping things, ta-da, you've lost some productivity. But where we have to start making decisions is when we start to exhibit diminishing marginal returns. So that's why we need to know, where does this occur, right? And again, it's not a slam dunk that I'm not going to hire the third. Again, I need more information. If the third worker costs me less than what they're bringing in as far as product, then I still want to keep them on. All right. And then also the fourth, once you hit that point, it's going to continue to go down, right? So once you hit that point, now they're bringing in 15. This is now a -5. The negative tells me I shouldn't even bother to bring them in, right? But again, the fourth one, I need more information. If it costs me $15, I'm indifferent. If they cost me $10, yeah, I'll bring in the fourth worker. If they're going to cost me $20 an hour, no, right? Because they're going to impact my profit. All right, so I'm going to pause there for part 1. Part 2, we'll talk about economic versus accounting profit.